Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a scalpel to one of the most intellectually stimulating and, let's be honest, delightfully strange films of the last year, Poor Things.
Oh, absolutely. It's a wild ride.
And you came to us with this intensely detailed source document, The Anatomy of the Social Monster. And our mission today is, well, it's pretty ambitious.
I think we're up for it.
We are going to dive deep and extract the core philosophical and sociological gold from this movie. We are not just talking about costume design here.
No.
We want to find out what this film is really doing.
Exactly. And, if you walked away from Poor Things thinking it was just a fantastical, quirky, or even a dirty comedy, then our source material suggests you completely missed the point.
Okay.
The report argues, and I think forcefully, that this isn't just an eccentric period piece. It's a horror film.
A horror film. Okay, unpack that for me right away. That's a huge reframing. It doesn't seem like a horror movie about manners.
But it is. The horror isn't biological. It's purely sociological. Right. The core premise, according to the report, is this meticulous vivisection of Victorian, and let's be perfectly clear, contemporary social rules.
Sure, it's not just about the past.
Not at all. The entire conflict is generated when a being of radical, untethered freedom, Bella Baxter, collides with this rigid, stratified thing we call polite society.
So the horror is the collision.
Yes. The world isn't charmed by Bella's innocence. The world is structurally terrified of an autonomous, non-integrated woman.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. You're moving the horror from the body on the operating table to the entire social body.
Precisely. And the report isn't just, offering a gut feeling. It provides a heavy theoretical blueprint for this analysis.
So we're not just doing an aesthetic reading. We have a framework.
We have some heavy intellectual artillery here, and we need to walk through it because these concepts really unlock the film's full power. First, there's a heavy lean on existential phenomenology, specifically Bella's journey from being, a raw being in itself, just unconscious existence, to becoming the ultimate being for itself, conscious freedom.
Ah, the classic Sartre move.
And that connects right into Simone de Beauvoir's work on gender performativity. It shows womanhood not as a fixed state, but as a performance.
A performance that Bella has to learn as a total outsider.
Exactly. Then we pivot to the sociology of manners, pulling from Foucault to dissect how the anticipation of shame is the primary mechanism of control.
And then finally, because her journey is so economic by the end,
you need that dash of Marxist materialism. You have to understand how she eventually seizes the means of production of her own body, her labor, and ultimately her destiny.
Wow. Okay, this really is a university seminar masquerading as a surreal cinematic experience.
It is. So let's jump straight into the lab. We need to analyze that initial philosophical variable. We have to understand why Bella Baxter, in her infancy, is so destabilizing to everyone around her.
So the foundational concept the report highlights is the tabula rasa, the blank slate. She isn't just an adult with a baby's brain. She is, at first, a philosophical variable with no history, no social learning. And the report connects this right away to Sartre's big idea. Existence precedes essence.
That is the perfect starting point. When we first meet her, she exists physically. She's biologically an adult woman before she has any defined essence.
Meaning?
No ingrained morality, no set personality, and this is the crucial part, no social identity. Her life is constructed entirely in real time.
Minute by minute.
Exactly. She lacks what the report calls historical baggage. And that, fundamentally, is the definition of radical freedom. But as we see, that kind of freedom is seen as dangerous by a society built on repression.
She's not even rebelling. She can't rebel against rules she doesn't know exist.
Right, and that sets up the grand, and for the other characters, horrifying experiment to the film, watching the Victorian social order just disintegrate.
Not because of the monster attacking it, but because one person refuses, unknowingly at first, to be integrated.
And the key weapon she wields, entirely by accident, is her complete, utter lack of shame.
That's the core sociological argument, isn't it? This report just drills down on this.
It does. Civilization, especially this highly structured, polite society, is sustained primarily by shame. The whole system works because people are afraid of what others think of them.
So talk more about shame in this context. It's not just an emotion. You're saying it's a piece of societal technology.
Absolutely. Shame is not some inherent natural state we're born with. It's the internalization of the external disapproving gaze. It's a self-policing mechanism.
It's Foucault's panopticon, but installed right inside your own head.
Precisely. You don't need a guard watching you. because you've already become your own guard. You self-censor.
But Bella.
Bella initially lacks the neural architecture to process this, that subtle fear of judgment. It's just not there. She doesn't have the guard installed.
And this is why the people around her, especially Duncan, are so genuinely horrified it drives them mad.
Completely.
Let's ground this in a specific moment. The report makes a crucial distinction here. Her early behavior is terrifying because it's amoral, not immoral.
Yes, and that difference is everything.
Explain that. Why does that matter so much to the civilized people watching her?
Well, immorality is acting against known rules, for personal gain or malice, whatever. Immorality is acting without any concept that rules exist in the first place.
So she's like an animal.
A hyper-efficient animal dedicated only to immediate utility and empirical fact. When she, urinates on the foyer floor or spits out the food she dislikes at dinner.
Okay, let's pause on the dinner scene. The custard. She tries it, hates it, and just spits it out. Why is that small action so shocking?
Because it reveals a catastrophic failure to perform the social script.
The script being?
The rule is, even if you hate the food, you smile, you nod, you swallow it, or at least pretend to. That tiny act of voluntary endurance is what holds the dinner table together.
But Bella violates that.
She violates the expectation that your own comfort and honesty must be sacrificed for appearances. She's not trying to be rude, she's just being direct. I dislike this, so I removed it from my mouth. In a Victorian drawing room, that is terrifying.
And what does that kind of behavior expose to someone like Max McCandles or later Duncan?
It reveals the profound, terrifying fragility of the entire social contract.
Oh, so?
If following the rules of etiquette is entirely voluntary, and we see Bella volunteering out of that contract, then the entire power hierarchy based on those rules is an illusion.
It's all built on a psychological agreement.
A voluntary submission. And Bella proves that submission is just an option, not a mandatory state of being.
Which brings us to the sociological heavy hitters. The report says she is violently breaching what Norbert Elias called the civilizing process.
Yes, Elias argued that Western history is this long march toward greater and greater control over our instincts, separating public from private.
We build what he called thresholds of repugnance.
Right. We learn to hide our bodies, hide our waist, hide our desires. Bella, by talking about furious jumping in polite company or just not masking her bodily functions, collapses those boundaries. She de-civilizes the room just by being authentic.
And that's a perfect link to Irving Goffman, too, which the report emphasizes. She completely obliterates the distinction between the front stage and the backstage.
Goffman's whole theory relies on that separation. For society to work, you have to believe that the person you see on the front stage, the polished public you, is different from the messy private reality of the backstage.
But Bella brings the backstage right into the drawing room.
She does. Her uninhibited body becomes this instrument of social disruption. She treats those rules not as laws of nature, but as just meaningless noise.
So the noise fails to pin her down. Let's talk about that in Althusserian terms. The failure of interpellation.
This is a great concept from critical theory. Interpellation is the process where society hails you into a subject position.
Like a police officer yelling, "Hey, you there!"
And you turn around. By turning, you accept that you are the subject being addressed. Society is constantly trying to hail Bella into fixed roles. Lady, wife, ward.
But she doesn't answer the call. Can you give me a concrete example of this failing in the film?
Absolutely. The entire dynamic with Duncan on the cruise ship is one long failed attempt at interpellation. He keeps trying to force the role of the repressed Victorian woman onto her.
Through romance, embarrassment, imprisonment?
All of it.
Yeah.
She's basically saying, you are a woman, therefore you must act like this.
Yeah.
But because she doesn't understand the codes, the history of repression, the subtle cues, she doesn't recognize herself in the role he's offering.
So the hailing just fails.
Completely. She doesn't answer, yes, that's me, the subservient lady. She remains a free subject, which is a structural impossibility for anyone raised inside the system.
She is the one who got away before she even knew she was a captive.
And that radical freedom, that self-construction, moves us beautifully into the next phase of her evolution.
Which is where we get to the heart of the film's feminist philosophy. And the report highlights one of the most powerful connections, Simone de Beauvoir.
One is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
And this film just literalizes that idea in the most compelling way possible.
It really does. She's biologically female, but she starts as a complete outsider observing womanhood as a social construct. She learns the rules of gender performance like they're arbitrary games.
Like a visitor from another planet watching some alien ritual.
Exactly. Which exposes gender itself as something you put on or take off, like a fancy dress, not some innate condition.
And what's crucial here is how she learns, compared to traditional socialization. The source points out that historically, women are taught womanhood through restriction.
Yes, it's a process of narrowing.
You learn what not to say, where not to go, how not to express desire.
Bella, though, learns through addition, through expansion. She accumulates experience, knowledge, physical skill, but without the corresponding inhibition that's supposed to come with it for a woman.
She's just charting her maturation through pure empiricism.
She experiences, she catalogs, she understands, she never apologizes for it.
Let's trace that maturation using the report's Beauvoirian analysis. It starts with infancy, or rebirth.
Right. That's the existence precedes essence phase. She's pure biology without any social definition. Motor dysfunction, pre-verbal, no modesty. She is only in the present moment. The report dryly calls her meat in motion.
Then we move to adolescence, or discovery. This is when she starts to interact with the world outside the house.
Yes, and this is the critical moment of confrontation with the other, the men and women of polite society. She realizes herself as a subject and actively refuses to be an object.
And her sexual exploration, the furious jumping, is central to this.
It is, but it's defined not as romantic submission or some moral failure, but as empirical research.
Wait, let's spend some time here. That interpretation is fascinating. Viewing her sexual awakening as empirical research, how does that change things?
It removes all the moral judgment. When Bella engages in sexual activity, she's collecting data points. What feels good, what's useful, what's pleasurable. It's a functional inquiry into the mechanisms of her own body.
She's trying to figure out how the machine works.
Exactly. And when Duncan tries to impose all this romantic or moral meaning onto it, he fails because she's seeing it through a lens of utility and experience accumulation. It's about data, not devotion.
That makes his desperation later on even more pathetic. He thinks he's offering her this transcendent experience.
And she just sees him as a pleasant, if eventually irritating, source of new information.
And that lack of sentimentality moves her to the third and final stage, maturation and autonomy.
This is where she truly transcends. This is the rejection of immanence, stagnation, domesticity, being a passive object for transcendence, action, travel, intellect.
She realizes the world is bigger than the house.
And that to achieve full autonomy, she needs economic and intellectual independence. That's what drives her to Paris and then to medical school.
Her entire trajectory is self-directed, and this is why the men around her are so viscerally anxious. They can't control the process.
Right. The becoming of a woman is supposed to be tightly managed by patriarchal institutions. The father, the church, the husband.
But Bella's evolution happens entirely outside their control.
Which renders those institutions obsolete. It suggests that the whole feminine mystique, the mystery, the supposed repression, is just a lack of information imposed by the system.
And Bella is rapidly correcting that lack of information.
And her knowledge, her data points, become the very thing that leads to the downfall of the men who try to control her.
If knowledge is her weapon, let's turn to the first man whose entire world is destroyed by her empiricism, Duncan Wedderburn.
Oh, Duncan.
If Bella is this force of total self-directed freedom, then Duncan Wedderburn is the definition of derivative control and, well, supreme fragility.
He is the libertine archetype distilled to its most pathetic form. He's a man who thinks he's a rebel, but his entire identity actually relies on the very system he pretends to defy.
He needs the hierarchy to exist so he can feel special for standing slightly outside of it.
Exactly. And he steps into the relationship with this huge Pygmalion complex. Bella's blank slate isn't a human to him. It's a canvas.
His canvas. For his desires.
He sees himself as the grand educator. He thinks if he controls her access to the world, he controls her mind.
Which is the classic, tragic flaw of the narcissist.
It is. He can't see that her mind is this hungry sponge, just absorbing data completely independently of his lessons.
And this is where the film does one of its most brilliant deconstructions, the reversal of the male gaze.
Yes. Duncan only ever looks at Bella. He sees her as a reflection of his own power, his own taste. He can't see her as a real person.
But Bella, she looks at everything.
Her gaze is panoptic. It's voracious. She's consuming the entire world, art, philosophy, pastries, sex, architecture, with the same raw, detached intensity.
And the most devastating moment for Duncan is when he realizes he's just one object among many in her study.
He's on the same level as a croissant
Yeah.
or a passing wave. His ego just shatters. because he's been reduced from the great subject to just another object of her observation.
The comedy of his arc and the horror for him is that he needs Bella to be just wild enough to excite him.
But tame enough to remain his possession.
And the second her wildness proves to be authentic and uncontrollable, he just collapses into this spectacular hysteria.
That is the pivotal moment.
Yeah.
His breakdown happens because all his social weapons are useless against her. He tries to use social censure. You must not eat that. You must not make that noise. You must not dance.
He tries to shame her.
And because she lacks the capacity for shame, those attacks are like firing blank ammunition.
You can't shame the shameless.
Precisely. He is completely disarmed. His only tool of control making her care what they think evaporates. And the fragile narcissist, as the report calls him, just can't handle it.
And the whole Don Juan persona he has. It requires his targets to be repressed so he can be the liberator.
But Bella has no repression to be liberated from.
Yeah?
She sees sex as fun or useful, so his role as the great seducer just vanishes. He's exposed as utterly useless.
And he becomes this pathetic, whining figure.
Exactly. And the film caps this analytical roasting with that profound final irony, the reversal of hysteria.
This is one of the sharpest critiques in the whole film. Historically, hysteria was the diagnosis for any woman who was inconvenient or nonconforming, the classic fallen woman.
And Lanthimos transfers that pathology entirely to Duncan. As Bella gains rationality, articulation, and knowledge, she becomes more sane.
While he becomes more emotional, erratic, and irrational.
And he ends up committed to an asylum, raving about his loss of control, a fate traditionally reserved for the very women he tried to manipulate.
It's a powerful critique of the gendered nature of sanity itself.
It's a phenomenal point. Sanity, in this film's world, is just the ability to control your environment. The moment Duncan loses control over Bella, he loses his grip on reality.
His sanity was dependent on her subjugation.
Completely. Which is the perfect transition from the fragile narcissist to Bella's two creator figures who represent entirely different philosophies of control.
Right. We move to her two fathers who could not be more different. Godwin Baxter and General Alfie Blessington. Let's start with Godwin, the scientific god.
Godwin is this immediate subversion of the Frankenstein archetype. He practices what the report calls responsible creativity.
Unlike Victor Frankenstein, who abandons his creation in disgust,
Godwin accepts the full ethical debt of creation. He knows he's responsible for this life.
and his own past, his own deformities from his father's experiments that profoundly influences him. He's both the scientist and the specimen.
That duality is crucial. It leads him to what the report calls his liberal education model. He restricts her physical world, the house is a lab, but he places absolutely no restriction on her intellectual or psychological development.
He encourages curiosity. He records her development with scientific fascination, not moral judgment.
And this is where he diverges so critically from patriarchal norms. When Bella decides to leave with Duncan, Godwin allows it.
Which seems counterintuitive for the scientist in him, doesn't it?
It does, but it validates his whole philosophy. He values her autonomy more than he values his possession of her. The report makes a powerful point here. For the experiment on human development to be valid, the subject has to be free.
Even if her choices are destructive.
Even then, he accepts the empirical fact that Bella needs to leave the house to grow. That acceptance is an intensely moral, anti-patriarchal act.
His entire philosophy seems to be that the only true sin is the refusal to know.
Which stands in stark contrast to the social moralities of Duncan and especially Alfie, which are based on sacred truths and things you're not supposed to question. Godwin is the Enlightenment ideal pushed to its logical conclusion.
So now we contrast that responsible, if eccentric, creator with General Alfie Blessington.
Who the report labels the final boss of patriarchy.
He really is.
Alfie is the complete embodiment of state-sanctioned violence, inherited power, and rigid, unyielding social order. Where Godwin is about observation and freedom, Alfie is about absolute imposition and control.
This is where the social horror becomes tangible, with the threat of biopolitics.
Yes, Alfie explicitly threatens to perform a clitoridectomy to cure Bella's wandering nature. He frames it as a medical treatment for her hysteria.
Which is the ultimate expression of polite society, using institutional tools, in this case medicine, to enforce its will on the female body.
It exposes how medicine has been weaponized historically as a tool of patriarchal control. His threat isn't passion. It's an administrative solution to the problem of her autonomy.
And the report connects his domestic abuse to imperial abuse, given his military background.
Absolutely. His mansion isn't a home. It's a microcosm of the empire, an institution that maintains order through force and the threat of bloodshed. He's the civilizing force in its most brutal form.
So we have the perfect contrast, the taxonomy of control, Godwin versus Alfie.
Let's just underline the difference in their goals. Godwin's goal is Bella's self-actualization. Alfie's goal is her complete subjugation, her regression back into the silent role of Victoria.
And their reactions to her autonomy say it all. When Bella makes a transgressive choice, Godwin's reaction is...
It is interesting. Pure scientific curiosity. He accepts the data.
Alfie's reaction is...
I will cut it out. Pure institutional violence. It's curiosity versus compulsion. One builds freedom, the other maintains order through mutilation.
This conflict brings us to the film's completely bizarre and radical conclusion. Bella's final confrontation with Alfie and his brain being transplanted into a goat.
And we are calling this exactly what the report suggests: the surgical removal of patriarchy.
It's just perfect.
This is the moment the film moves beyond individual liberation and into radical systemic critique. The act is justice, delivered surgically. But we have to understand the symbolism of the goat.
Historically loaded, it's associated with the subtle unbridled male lust, chaos.
A lack of civilization. By putting the general's brain into a goat, Bella is externalizing his internal reality. She's revealing that beneath the uniform and the manners and the medals, Alfie was always a beast.
The goat isn't random, it's a physical manifestation of his soul.
And the report frames this act not as revenge, but as a cool, calculated correction.
She takes on the mantle of the creator, the surgeon.
And she diagnoses Alfie's toxicity, his intolerance, his violence, as a pathology that has to be excised from her environment.
She doesn't destroy him. She reconfigures him into a form that can no longer do harm. It's the ultimate assertion of radical autonomy.
She reshapes the world and the men in it to ensure her own safety and freedom. She's learned the skills of her creator, and now she's applying them to a destructive force.
This, of course, brings up the paradox of tolerance.
It does. And the report suggests a hard truth. For Bella's free utopian society to survive, the violently intolerant Alfie must be neutralized.
The patriarchy in this reading can't be reasoned with.
It must be structurally, surgically altered, because its foundational demand is violence. When freedom is faced with an existential threat, that threat has to be physically removed.
And this act of definitive control ties directly into the Marxist feminist reading of the climax, seizing the means of production.
This is the final philosophical leap in her journey. She moves through a perfect Marxist trajectory. From object Godwin's creation, Duncan's property to subject, the researcher, to finally the creator and manager.
Her journey involves reclaiming the means of production, her own body and her labor.
Exactly.
Let's connect that for the listener. How does her time in the Paris brothel relate to this?
Well, in the brothel, she quickly realizes she is the worker, creating the value, the pleasure, the experience. And the owner is just taking the surplus.
So she starts dictating the terms for labor.
She realizes her body is a productive economic force, and she controls that force. That intellectual leap, that economic awareness, is a form of self-possession.
And by the end, she literally seizes the larger means of reproduction and creation Godwin's lab.
Exactly. She moves from being the product to the owner of the entire enterprise. She controls the science, the space, the destiny of everyone in it. And she builds this utopia of the strange.
Your final household is queer, non-normative.
Biology is fluid. Social roles are chosen. It is the definitive triumph of the monstrous over the polite world that tried and failed to contain her.
And it's so important that the final shot we get of her, despite her union with Max, isn't domestic bliss.
No. It's her studying for her medical exams.
That intellectual labor is presented as the ultimate ongoing act of autonomy.
It is the decision to define the world through her own intellect, rather than accepting the definitions handed down by society. She is gaining the power to control her environment ethically, rationally, and surgically.
So to bring this all together, let's just revisit that spectrum of male control from the report and how Bella dismantles each type. It really shows her progression.
It's a phenomenal summary of her growth. First, you have Duncan Wedderburn, the seductive, narcissistic type.
He relies on shame and romance.
And Bella dismantles him through absolute indifference and pure empiricism. She treats his tantrums like clinical data.
Then there's General Alfie, the violent institutional type.
He relies on force and mutilation. Bella meets this with superior force, surgical intervention. She neutralizes the threat.
Then Godwin Baxter, the paternal scientific type. He controls the environment but believes in freedom.
And she dismantles his control simply by evolving beyond the lab, And he accepts it, and their relationship becomes one of mutual respect.
And finally, Max McCandles, the romantic, passive type. He tries to bind her with a traditional marriage contract.
And Bella dismantles that by simply renegotiating the contract into a partnership of equals where she dictates the terms. She forces him to operate in her world, not society's.
So her ultimate weapon against every form of control, seductive, violent, paternal, is intellectual labor and her refusal to feel shame.
The film argues that true agency requires a traumatic break from the social order, a willingness to be labeled a monster.
The most dangerous thing is an uninhibited mind.
Bella Baxter is the uber woman who creates her own values, uninhibited by the psychological chains of guilt or shame.
So, in the end, Poor Things is an optimistic, existentialist text. That feels like a powerful conclusion for a film that's so dark and strange.
Absolutely. It says that while we are thrown into a world of arbitrary rules and cruel masters, the human capacity for growth, if you can get past the shame and dogma, is infinite.
The whole satire shows that manners, class, gender roles, they aren't the glue holding the world together.
They're the chains holding it down.
And by breaking them, she doesn't descend into chaos. She ascends into a higher form of rationality. She achieves self-possession.
And that self-possession gives her the power to heal her world, or at least to reorganize the toxic parts of it. She concludes that the only way to be free is to be willing to be a poor thing, a monster, and to write your own name on the world with science and shamelessness.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive into the anatomy of the social monster, and the report's final takeaway is incredibly potent. It should genuinely change how you view the film, and maybe the world.
The scariest monster in this movie isn't the reanimated creature. It isn't the creature of instinct. It is a woman who achieves total structural autonomy and doesn't need men or any social institution to define her existence or her value.
That's the real horror show for polite society.
It is.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you to carry forward, connecting Bella's journey to our world right now. If society's only chains are psychological, if institutions are sustained only by the enforcement of shame and absurd expectations, what would happen if you chose to be a monster and refused to be integrated?
What institutions in our world are sustained only by the fear of being impolite, of stepping out of line? And what if you decided to structurally alter them, even just in your own life?
Something potent to ponder.
Until our next deep dive.
We'll see you soon.